There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, a simple request folded into the quiet fabric of an evening. They don't announce themselves with thunder or trumpets. They come in a whisper. They are the doors that creak open just enough to show you a room you never knew existed, a future you never dared to map. For me, that moment came dressed in the mundane clothes of a Tuesday night, smelling of stale coffee and the low-grade hum of a laptop fan. It came in the form of a question from my roommate, Liam, a question that hung in the air between our two separate lives, a fragile bridge built of 5 simple words. He was standing in the doorway of his bedroom, a silhouette framed against the soft lamplight inside, and his shadow stretched long and thin across the hallway floor, almost touching the tips of my socks. I had been making my way to my own room, a nightly ritual of retreat into the curated silence of my own space, a space filled with camera equipment, half-finished photo edits, and the ghosts of images I had yet to capture. The apartment was quiet, the way it always was after 10. The city outside had softened its roar to a distant, rhythmic breathing, and the only immediate sounds were the creak of the floorboards under my feet and the gentle sigh of the old building settling into the cold. Liam had been working late again, a marathon of code and deadlines that had been draining the light from him for weeks. I could see the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders, in the way his head was bowed just slightly, as if the weight of the day was a physical burden he was still learning to carry. He was usually the vibrant one, the engine of our shared space, his energy filling the rooms with an easy confidence that I, in my quieter orbit, had always admired and secretly leaned on. But tonight, that energy was a dim flicker. Ethan, his voice was lower than usual, roughened by fatigue. I stopped, my hand hovering over the cool brass of my doorknob. Yeah? Everything okay? I asked, keeping my own voice soft, careful not to break the delicate stillness of the hour. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, one hand braced against the doorframe, the other rubbing at the back of his neck. In the dim hallway light, I could see the tension in his knuckles, the weariness etched into the lines of his face. He looked lost, not physically, but internally, like a man staring at a complex schematic for which he had no key. He was a problem solver, a software engineer who built elegant, logical structures out of chaos for a living. Seeing him adrift in his own emotional architecture was unsettling. It was like watching a master cartographer admit he could no longer read his own maps. He started, then hesitated, his gaze dropping to the worn wooden floor between us. This is going to sound weird, I waited. I had become an expert in waiting for Liam. For 3 years, our friendship had been a study in orbits. He was the sun, bright and effortlessly warm, and I was a planet held in his gravity, content to trace the same steady, predictable path, to observe his light without ever daring to get closer, terrified of the burn. I had learned the nuances of his silences, the subtle shifts in his moods that he thought he hid so well. I had cataloged the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes when he was stressed, the way he would drum his fingers on a tabletop when his mind was racing miles ahead of the conversation. I was a quiet archivist of the man I loved, a man who had no idea he was the sole subject of my collection. I just feel really lonely tonight, he finally said, the words coming out in a rush, as if they had been fighting to stay behind his teeth. He looked up, and his eyes, usually a clear and confident blue, were clouded with a vulnerability that struck me with the force of a physical blow. It was a look I had never seen on him before, a raw and unguarded honesty that stripped away all the layers of easy charm and laid bare something fragile and aching underneath. My own heart gave a painful thud against my ribs. Loneliness was a language I was fluent in. It was the native tongue of my inner world, a place I rarely invited anyone else to visit. To hear him speak it, to hear him admit to being a citizen of that same quiet, desolate country, felt like a seismic shift in the landscape of our friendship. "I'm sorry, man," I said, and the words felt hopelessly inadequate. "The project's still kicking your ass?" He nodded, a slow, tired movement. "It's not just that. It's everything. Just the quiet. The room feels too big tonight, you know?" He gestured vaguely back into his bedroom, a space that was usually a haven of organized, minimalist calm. My brain won't shut off. I just keep running in circles. He finally looked at me directly, his gaze so pleading and open that I felt my carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble. Could you just sit with me? Until I fall asleep? And there it was. The hook. The quiet question that changed the tide. It wasn't a proposition, not a confession, not a declaration. It was a simple, desperate request for presence, for a human anchor in the churning sea of his own anxiety. But for me, a man who had spent years carefully managing the distance between us, meticulously policing the border between friendship and a love he would never know, it was everything. It was a hand extended across a chasm I had long since accepted as uncrossable. To say yes was to step onto that fragile bridge, to risk the fall. To say no was to reinforce the walls I was already beginning to suffocate behind. In that moment, suspended in the silent hallway of our shared home, I knew that no matter my answer, nothing would ever be quite the same. The door was creaking open. We met in the autumn of our sophomore year of college, thrown together by the indifferent algorithms of the university's housing department. I remember walking into that sterile, cinder-block dorm room for the first time, my camera bag slung over one shoulder and a box of books in my arms, and seeing him already there. He was standing on his bed, wrestling with a poster of some obscure indie band, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was all sharp angles and kinetic energy, a whirlwind of motion in the small, cramped space. He turned when he heard me, a wide, easy grin instantly spreading across his face, and he hopped down from the mattress with a startling grace. "Hey, you must be Ethan. I'm Liam. Welcome to the palace." That was him. Effortless. He made friends the way most people breathe, a natural and unconscious act of connection. I, on the other hand, collected acquaintances like I collected photographs, carefully, from a distance, always more comfortable behind the lens than in the frame. I was the quiet one, the observer. My world was built of light and shadow, of compositions and captured moments. People were often too loud, too unpredictable, their emotional landscapes too vast and messy to navigate with any certainty. But Liam was different. He wasn't messy. He was a force of nature, like a clear, fast-moving river. He pulled me into his current without my even realizing it. He drew me out of my shell not by force, but by simply making the world outside seem more interesting, more vibrant, whenever he was in it. He'd drag me to parties where I would spend most of the night in a corner, nursing a single drink, but I went because he asked. He'd convince me to join impromptu late-night study sessions that devolved into philosophical debates about films I'd never seen, and I'd find myself talking more than I had in weeks. Our friendship was forged in the crucible of shared space and opposing personalities. He was the sound, I was the silence. He was the motion, I was the stillness. We were a study in contrasts, a perfect, unlikely balance. He respected my need for solitude, and I admired his ability to connect with the world. He never pushed me to be more like him, and I never judged him for his boundless social energy. We carved out a comfortable existence in that tiny room, learning the rhythms of each other's lives. I learned that he snored, but only when he was on his back. I learned that he was a surprisingly meticulous organizer, his side of the room a testament to minimalist order, while mine was a creative chaos of prints and contact sheets. He learned that I needed at least 2 cups of black coffee before I could form a coherent sentence in the morning. He learned to recognize the specific kind of quiet that meant I was deep in an editing trance and shouldn't be disturbed. The feelings, for my part, crept in so slowly I didn't recognize them for what they were at first. They started as a simple appreciation, an admiration for his kindness and his unwavering optimism. Then it deepened into a profound sense of comfort, a feeling of rightness whenever he was near. I found myself watching him more and more, not as a photographer studying a subject, but as something more personal. I'd watched the way the afternoon light caught the gold flecks in his blue eyes, the way he'd run a hand through his sandy brown hair when he was frustrated with a line of code, the sheer, unself-conscious joy in his laughter. My camera, an extension of my own eye, started to find him more often. I have a whole folder on a hidden hard drive, a secret cartography of him. Liam asleep with a textbook on his chest, Liam silhouetted against a sunset on the campus quad, Liam laughing with friends at a coffee shop, the focus soft, all my attention on him. These images were my unsent love letters, my silent confessions. I knew, of course, that he was straight. It was never a question. There was a string of girlfriends throughout college, all bright, lovely women who seemed to fit so perfectly into the easy narrative of his life. There was Sarah, the artist, and then Chloe, the pre-med student. I was always polite, always friendly, the supportive roommate. I listened to him talk about them, offered advice when he asked for it, and quietly locked away the dull, persistent ache in my own chest. I built a fortress around my heart, its walls plastered with the logic of our friendship. He was my best friend. That was the foundation of everything, the bedrock upon which our lives were built. To risk that, to confess the truth and shatter that foundation, was unthinkable. It would be a selfish act, a demolition of the most stable and important relationship in my life for the slim, impossible chance that he might feel the same. So I buried it. I buried it deep under layers of camaraderie and inside jokes, and shared pizzas on a Friday night. I became a master of emotional containment. After graduation, when the world was pulling our other friends in a dozen different directions, it seemed only natural that Liam and I would get an apartment together. It was an unspoken assumption. We were a unit, a fixed point in the chaotic swirl of post-college uncertainty. We found a two-bedroom place in a quiet, older building with good light and creaky floors, and we fell into a new domestic rhythm that was an echo of our dorm room days, only now with the added pressures of careers and bills. He got a demanding job at a tech startup, and I began the slow, arduous process of building a freelance photography career. Our lives were separate, yet intertwined. We were anchors for each other. He was the one person who understood why I needed to spend an entire day chasing the perfect light for a single shot. And I was the one person who could tell from the sound of his typing whether his code was flowing or fighting him. The last girlfriend, Jessica, had been the most serious. They had dated for over a year, and for a while, I thought he was going to ask her to move in. I had prepared myself for it, rehearsing the nonchalant, supportive response I would give, even as the thought of it felt like a physical weight in my stomach. But then, about 6 months before that night in the hallway, it ended. It was a quiet, sad unraveling, not a dramatic explosion. He never talked about the details, but I could see the fallout. He threw himself into his work with a new, frantic intensity. He went out less. The easy, bright energy that had always defined him began to dim, replaced by a restless, searching quality. The silence in the apartment grew heavier, no longer just a comfortable quiet, but something lonelier, something more profound. I saw his loneliness because it was a mirror of my own. We were two people living parallel lives in the same space, separated by a wall of unspoken truths. And it was this slow, creeping isolation, this shared but unacknowledged solitude, that finally eroded the foundations of his own self-sufficiency and led him to my door on a Tuesday night, asking for something neither of us had the words to define. He was asking for help. He was asking for comfort. And in doing so, he was unknowingly asking me to confront the very feelings I had spent years trying to pretend did not exist. The shift was subtle at first, a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. It began in the weeks following his breakup with Jessica. The initial catalyst was external, a clear and defined event that changed the emotional topography of his life. But its effects were internal, a slow erosion that exposed a deeper need. His work had always been demanding, but now it became an obsession, a fortress he'd built around himself. The project he was leading was a high-stakes, high-pressure endeavor, and it started to consume him completely. He worked longer hours, his sleep schedule became erratic, and the easygoing confidence that was his default state began to fray at the edges, revealing the anxious, stressed-out wiring underneath. He was trying to code his way through his heartbreak, to build a logical system that could contain the logical pain of loss and loneliness. But life, unlike code, rarely compiles without errors. I watched it happen from my quiet perch, my role as the observer becoming more and more painful. I would hear him come in late at night, the weary sigh as he dropped his keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, the click of his office door shutting, followed by the soft, persistent tap of his keyboard starting up again. Sometimes I'd leave a plate of food for him in the microwave, a silent gesture of care he would acknowledge the next morning with a tired but grateful, "Thanks, man. You saved me." We still had our moments of connection. Brief conversations over coffee in the morning, a shared takeout meal eaten in front of the television when he finally surfaced for air, but they were islands in a growing ocean of his preoccupation. He was adrift, and he was trying desperately to pretend he still knew how to navigate. The loneliness, which had always been a low hum in the background of my own life, became a palpable presence in our apartment. It was a third roommate, silent and unseen, that sat between us on the couch and followed us down the hall. I saw him trying to fight it in his own way. He'd make plans with friends and then cancel at the last minute, citing a work emergency that I suspected was more of an emotional retreat. He'd scroll through his phone with a blank expression, the blue light of the screen illuminating a face that looked hollowed out. He was surrounded by a digital world of connection, yet he had never seemed more isolated. The breakup had severed a primary anchor, and his work, his substitute anchor, was proving to be made of stone, pulling him deeper instead of holding him steady. He started talking more about the pressure, not in long, soul-bearing conversations, but in short, clipped fragments. "The launch is in 3 weeks, and the back end is a mess," he'd mutter while staring into the refrigerator, not really seeing anything. Or, "I think I spent 12 hours today staring at the same block of code." These were not invitations for me to solve his problems. He was a man who prided himself on his self-reliance. They were, I began to realize, small cracks appearing in the dam, pressure vents releasing a tiny fraction of the immense force building up inside him. He was speaking of code, but he was talking about his own internal state, a system on the verge of crashing. I tried to be a friend in the only way I knew how. I kept the apartment clean. I made sure we had groceries. I offered to screen a movie, to go for a walk, to do anything that might pull him away from the magnetic field of his laptop. Most of the time he would decline with a tired smile, but he always seemed grateful for the offer. He was grateful for my presence, for the quiet stability I represented in his increasingly chaotic world. I was the constant, the part of his life that didn't require debugging. It was during this period that the physical boundaries between us began to soften, almost imperceptibly at first. He'd be working on the couch, and I'd be reading in the armchair, and without thinking, he'd stretch out his legs and rest his feet in my lap. The first time it happened, my entire body went rigid, every nerve ending firing an alarm. But he was so engrossed in his work, so seemingly unaware of the casual intimacy of the act, that I forced myself to relax, to accept it as the meaningless gesture of a tired friend. It became a regular occurrence. This was the new landscape, a landscape of blurred lines and unspoken needs. He was lonely, exhausted, and stressed, a potent combination that was dismantling his usual defenses. He was reaching out, not with words, but with proximity. He was closing the physical distance between us because he didn't know how to close the emotional one. He didn't know how to say, "I'm not okay. I feel like I'm falling apart, and I'm scared," so instead, he put his feet in my lap. He started leaving the door to his office open while he worked. He sought my quiet company more and more, as if my stillness could somehow soothe his racing mind. The change was happening in him, a profound internal crisis that was making him seek a new kind of comfort, a new level of closeness. He was turning to me, his steadfast, predictable friend, for something more than friendship, even if he didn't have a name for it himself. And this shift, born of his pain and loneliness, was what led him to my doorway, to ask me to sit with him in the dark, because the quiet of his own room had finally become too loud to bear alone. So I said yes. Of course I said yes. It felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability, the only possible response to the raw need in his voice. I followed him into his room, my heart a frantic, fluttering bird against my ribs. The room was just as I expected, Minimalist, clean, yet charged with the nervous energy of his sleeplessness. A single lamp on his nightstand cast a warm, soft glow over everything, turning the familiar space into something more intimate, more sacred. He got into bed, pulling the covers up to his chest, and I took a seat in the worn wooden chair by his desk, positioning it so I was facing him. The distance between us was maybe 6 feet, but it felt like a universe. The silence that fell was thick and heavy, filled with everything we weren't saying. "You don't have to do this," he whispered into the quiet, his eyes fixed on me. "It's stupid, it's not stupid," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "Just try to sleep." And so the ritual began. That first night, I sat in the chair for almost an hour, my body ramrod straight, every muscle tensed. I listened to the sound of his breathing, waiting for it to deepen and even out into the rhythm of sleep. I watched the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the way his eyelashes cast long shadows on his cheeks in the lamplight. It was an exercise in excruciating self-control. I was a guard on duty, a sentinel watching over his rest, and my only job was not to betray the wild, chaotic storm of emotion that was raging inside of me. When I was finally sure he was asleep, I slipped out of the room as quietly as I could, my own body humming with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep and everything to do with emotional exertion. A few nights later, he asked again. This time, the request was less hesitant, more matter of fact, as if we were already establishing a new, unspoken routine. "Hey, Ethan, you mind?" he asked from his doorway, and I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. That night, the chair felt farther away, the distance more pronounced. After about 20 minutes of him tossing and turning, his sighs filling the silence, he spoke again, his voice small. "This isn't working. The chair is too far." A pause, then, "Could you sit on the bed instead?" My breath caught. This was an escalation, a deliberate closing of the space I had been using as a buffer. Every alarm in my head was screaming, but the quiet desperation in his voice overrode them all. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady, and moved to the edge of his bed. I sat down carefully, perching on the last few inches of the mattress, my back to him, facing the wall. I could feel the warmth of his body through the comforter, a low-grade heat that seemed to radiate directly into my spine. I stared at the faint patterns on his wallpaper, focusing on them with an intensity that bordered on madness, using them as an anchor to keep from turning around, to keep from doing something I would regret. He shifted behind me, and the mattress dipped, bringing his body infinitesimally closer. A soft sigh of contentment escaped his lips, and within minutes, his breathing deepened. He was asleep. The simple change in proximity had been enough. This became the new ritual. He would ask, I would come. I would sit on the edge of his bed, a silent, rigid guardian, until he drifted off. We never spoke of it in the morning. In the bright, unforgiving light of day, we would revert to our old roles. We'd talk about work, about the news, about what to get for dinner. We were roommates, friends. The nights were a separate reality, a secret, shared space that existed in the dim light and hushed tones of his bedroom, a reality that was immediately dismantled and packed away when the sun came up. It was a strange, bifurcated existence, and the strain of it was beginning to wear on me. I was living a double life within the walls of my own home. My mind was a relentless courtroom, where I would spend my days analyzing the evidence of the previous night. What did that sign mean? Did he move closer on purpose? Was this just about his anxiety, or was it something more? I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I was terrified of finding an answer. The anxiety was a constant companion, a low hum beneath the surface of my days. My photography suffered. I couldn't focus. Every time I looked through the lens, I felt like I was the one being exposed, my own inner world laid bare. The camera, once my shield, now felt like a mirror. I was so hyper-aware of him, of our delicate, dangerous dance, that the rest of the world seemed to fade into a soft, indistinct background. My love for him, once a quiet, manageable ache, had become a raw, open wound that his nightly requests both soothed and agitated. Each night was a dose of a powerful, addictive drug. It brought me a terrifying, exquisite closeness to him, a closeness I craved with every fiber of my being. But it also amplified the pain of knowing the context was all wrong. I was a placeholder for comfort, a human-weighted blanket. I was not, in his mind, anything more. Then came the night that the ritual changed again, irrevocably. It was a Friday. He'd had a particularly brutal week, the kind that leaves a person hollowed out and fragile. He didn't even ask from his doorway. He found me in the living room, where I was trying to lose myself in a book, and just stood in front of me until I looked up. His eyes were shadowed, his face pale. "I'm really tired tonight," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't think I can even get to sleep." It was the most vulnerable I had ever seen him. He looked like a child, lost and overwhelmed. I followed him to his room without a word. I took my usual spot on the edge of the bed, my back to him. The silence stretched on, longer than usual, punctuated by his restless shifting. I could feel his distress as a physical thing, a vibration in the mattress. "Ethan," he said, his voice thick with a desperate exhaustion. "Please, can you just lie down? Just for a little while. I think it would help if you were just here." My heart stopped. Then it started again, hammering against my ribs like a trapped thing. This was it, the final boundary. To cross it was to abandon any pretense of platonic distance. It was to admit, through action, what I could never say in words. To lie down in his bed, next to him, was to step off the cliff, trusting that there was something below besides a long, painful fall. I turned my head and looked at him. He was watching me, his expression a mixture of hope and fear, the same emotions that were churning in my own gut. In his eyes, I saw not just a request for comfort, but a question he probably didn't even know he was asking. Slowly, as if moving through water, I swung my legs onto the bed. I lay down on top of the comforter, on my back, as far to the edge as I could possibly get. I stared up at the ceiling, my hands clasped tightly on my stomach, my entire body a single, rigid line of tension. The air was electric. I could feel his warmth beside me, a magnetic pull. I could hear the hitch in his breath. For several long minutes, we lay there in a charged, absolute silence, two bodies in the same bed, a universe of unspoken feelings separating us. Then he moved. It was a small shift, a hesitant shuffle across the mattress. I felt his arm brush against mine, a fleeting touch of skin on fabric that sent a jolt through my entire system. He didn't pull away. He let his arm rest there, a line of warmth against my own. And then, his breathing began to change. It deepened, softened, and slowly, finally, settled into the steady, even rhythm of sleep. He hadn't just needed my presence in the room. He had needed my proximity. He had needed my touch. And as I lay there in the dark, my heart aching with a feeling so vast and complicated I couldn't even name it, I knew that the ritual had been transformed. It was no longer just about his loneliness. It was now about ours. The nights that followed that turning point existed in a dreamlike state of heightened reality. Lying down beside him became the new, unspoken rule of our ritual. Every night, or every other night, the quiet request would come, and I would follow him into the soft, dim light of his room and lie beside him, a silent sentry on top of the covers. We were artists of denial, crafting a masterpiece of plausible deniability. It was just for his sleep. It was just because his anxiety was bad. It was just what friends did, in some strange, undefined corner of friendship that neither of us dared to examine too closely in the light of day. But the tension, the sheer, unbearable weight of what was happening between us, was becoming a physical presence in the room, as tangible as the bed we were sharing. My senses were dialed to an impossible frequency. I was aware of everything. I was aware of the subtle scent of his shampoo, a clean, sandalwood fragrance that I found myself breathing in deeply when I thought he couldn't notice. I was aware of the exact distance between our bodies, a space of a few inches that felt both like a gaping chasm and an impossibly thin membrane. I was aware of the faint sound of his heartbeat, a steady, muffled drum that sometimes seemed to sync with the frantic rhythm of my own. I would lie there, my body rigid with the effort of feigning relaxation, and I would map the geography of his sleep. I learned that he sometimes twitched in the first few minutes of drifting off, his fingers flexing or his leg jerking slightly. I learned that he occasionally mumbled soft, incoherent words that I would strain to hear, hoping for some clue, some accidental confession from his subconscious. One night, about a week after I first lay down beside him, he rolled over in his sleep. It was a slow, unconscious movement, but it closed the careful distance I always maintained between us. His back was suddenly pressed against my side, from my shoulder down to my hip. The contact was electric. A wave of heat washed over me, and I had to physically bite the inside of my cheek to keep from flinching away. My first instinct was pure panic, the fear of discovery, the terror that this proximity would somehow expose the truth of my feelings. But he just settled into the position with a soft, contented sigh, his body relaxing against mine in a way that spoke of pure, unthinking trust. He felt safe with me. The realization was both a profound comfort and a source of exquisite pain. I lay there for what felt like hours, my entire side burning where we touched, not daring to move, not daring to breathe too deeply, until I was sure he was in a deep sleep. I was a statue of yearning, trapped by his innocent, trusting warmth. The most difficult part was the morning after. The ritual demanded a collective amnesia. We would wake in our own beds. I always slipped away in the dead of night, a ghost returning to his own room, and meet in the kitchen as if nothing had happened. We'd make coffee, discuss our plans for the day, and carefully, meticulously, avoid any mention of the shared intimacy of the night before. It was a silent, mutual agreement. To speak of it would be to give it a name, and to name it would be to force us to confront its meaning. We were both cowards, in our own way. He was hiding from his loneliness and confusion, and I was hiding from a love I was sure would be rejected. The silence was our shield, our shared conspiracy. But the silence was also corrosive. It was breeding a strange resentment in me. I was becoming frustrated with his seeming obliviousness, with his ability to take this profound intimacy from me and then act as if it were nothing more than a glass of warm milk. Did he really not feel it? Did he not feel the electric current that hummed in the space between us? Was I truly the only one living in this heightened state, while for him, it was merely a practical solution to a temporary problem? The internal debate raged within me. One part of me, the hopeful, romantic part, saw every touch, every quiet request, as a sign of something deeper, a subconscious pull towards me that he hadn't yet acknowledged. The other part, the cynical, self-protective part, told me I was a fool, a convenience, a tool he was using to manage his own emotional turmoil without any regard for what it was doing to me. The breaking point came on a rainy Saturday night. The weather was a perfect mirror of my internal state, gray, turbulent, and melancholic. We had spent the day in the apartment, the rain drumming a relentless rhythm against the window panes. We watched a movie, a comfortable, familiar activity from our past, but the dynamic had shifted. I was acutely aware of his presence beside me on the couch, the way his knee would occasionally brush against mine, the shared space feeling smaller, more charged than ever before. Later that night, predictably, the request came. "Ethan." I followed him. I lay down in my usual spot. The rain lashed against the glass, and the room was darker than usual, the only light a faint, silvery glow from the streetlights filtering through the blinds. He was restless, his body tense beside me. The silence stretched on, filled only by the sound of the storm outside and the storm inside my own chest. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't lie there in this charged, dishonest silence for one more night. The pretense was suffocating me. He must have sensed my own tension, because he shifted, turning to face me in the darkness. I could just make out the shape of him, the line of his shoulder, the silhouette of his head on the pillow. "You okay?" he whispered. "You seem far away." The irony of his words was a sharp, painful jab. Far away? I was so close to him I could feel the warmth of his breath, yet we were miles apart. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. The years of carefully guarded silence, the weeks of agonizing tension, it all just broke. I turned onto my side to face him. The space between us was now barely a foot. I could see the faint glint of light in his eyes. He was watching me, waiting. My heart was a frantic drum solo against the backbeat of the rain. Liam, I started, my voice hoarse. What are we doing? He was silent for a moment. What do you mean? You're helping me get to sleep. The answer was so simple, so painfully literal, that it almost broke me. No, I said, my voice gaining a fragile strength. I mean, what is this? Lying here every night, not talking about it. What is this to you? I could feel him retreat, a subtle tensing of his body, a pulling back of his energy. He was a creature of comfort, and I was introducing a profound discomfort. I was breaking the rules of our silent game. He rolled onto his back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. I don't know, Ethan, he said, and his voice was small, lost. I just know that it helps. When you're here, the noise in my head stops. I feel safe. I don't know why. I know why. I wanted to scream. It's because I love you. It's because for 3 years, every quiet, steady part of my soul has been oriented towards you. You feel safe because you are, and have always been, the safest place I know. But I didn't say that. The words were too big, too dangerous. Instead, I pushed, just a little. But it's not just that, is it? He didn't answer. The silence was his confession. It wasn't just about the anxiety. It was something more, something he was either unable or unwilling to see. And then, he did something that shattered the ritual, and me, into a million pieces. He reached out in the darkness, his hands searching, and his fingers found mine. He didn't grab my hand. He just rested his fingers over the back of it. It was a touch so tentative, so feather-light, it was almost not there at all. A question asked in the language of skin. And then, just as my heart was about to explode with a terrifying, soaring hope, he whispered the words that would change everything. Would it be okay? He breathed into the rainy darkness, his voice trembling slightly. If I kissed you? The world stopped. The rain, the city, my own frantic heartbeat, it all went silent. There was only his question, hanging in the air between us, a fragile, impossible thing. It was the moment I had simultaneously dreamed of and dreaded for years. It was the crossing of a line so definitive that there would be no going back, no retreating into the comfortable fiction of our friendship. This was the precipice, and he was asking me for permission to jump. He was asking me to jump with him. My mind raced, a chaotic slideshow of every possible future. The future where this was a mistake, a moment of confused desperation on his part that would shatter our friendship into irreparable pieces. The future where it was a fleeting curiosity, an experiment he would regret in the morning. And then there was the other future, the one I had never truly allowed myself to imagine, the one that was so bright it was painful to look at. The future where this was real. I could feel the tremor in his fingers, still resting so lightly on my hand. He was terrified. This wasn't a casual act. This was a confession, wrung from a place of deep confusion and undeniable feeling. He had finally arrived at the edge of the same cliff where I had been living for years, and he was just as scared of the fall as I was. In his fear, I found my courage. I didn't answer with words. I answered by turning my hand over, by slowly, deliberately, lacing my fingers through his. It was a simple gesture, but it was my surrender. It was my yes. It was my acceptance of the risk, my willingness to meet him in this terrifying, uncharted territory. He took a shaky breath. I felt him move closer, the mattress shifting under his weight. I closed my eyes, my entire being focused on the feeling of his hand in mine, the sound of his breathing, the sense of his presence drawing nearer in the dark. He was so close now I could feel the warmth radiating from his face. He hesitated for a heartbeat, a final moment of uncertainty, and then his lips met mine. It was not a passionate kiss. It was not demanding or confident. It was tentative. It was soft. It was unbelievably gentle. It was a question, a search, a discovery. It was the taste of rain and salt and a loneliness so profound it had finally found its echo in another. It was hesitant and questioning, a soft pressure that spoke more of vulnerability than desire. It was a confession made in the dark, where words had failed. It was him, finally, admitting that the comfort he sought from me was not platonic, that the safety he felt was not the safety of a brother, but something else entirely. And I responded in kind, meeting his gentleness with my own, pouring all the years of my silent, patient love into that one impossibly soft touch. We were not two friends anymore. We were two people finding a new language, and this was the first fumbling word. The aftermath was not a sun-drenched meadow of clarity and relief. It was a thick, disorienting fog. The kiss, that quiet, world-altering event, was followed by an immediate and profound silence. Liam pulled back, and the space between our lips felt charged, dangerous. He didn't let go of my hand, but his grip felt less certain. In the darkness, I could feel his retreat, not a physical one, but an emotional one. He had leaped, but the moment his feet left the cliff's edge, he was seized by a paralyzing fear of the fall. He had crossed a line he had never even acknowledged existed, and the reality of his own action seemed to overwhelm him. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice strained. He finally let go of my hand, and the loss of contact was a cold shock. He rolled onto his back, away from me, creating a gulf between us on the mattress. I shouldn't have done that. I'm so tired. I'm not thinking straight. I'm sorry, Ethan. Each word was a carefully placed stone, rebuilding the wall between us. But this time the bricks were made of confusion and regret. He was already trying to undo it, to file it away as an aberration, a symptom of his exhaustion. And my heart, which had been soaring only moments before, plummeted. The pain was sharp and immediate, a betrayal not of my love, but of the honesty of that moment. He was invalidating his own feelings, and in doing so, he was invalidating me. The hope that had flared so brightly was extinguished, leaving behind the bitter smoke of disappointment. I lay there for another minute, my body rigid with hurt, listening to the sound of his unsteady breathing. Then, without a word, I got up and left his room. I didn't flee. I walked. It was a deliberate, measured retreat. As I crossed the hallway to my own room, I felt his eyes on my back. I closed my door behind me, the soft click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the silent apartment. I didn't turn on the light. I just stood in the center of my room, the darkness a cold comfort, and I felt the full weight of my own foolishness crash down on me. I had allowed myself to hope. I had misinterpreted everything. I was, and had always been, a convenience. A source of comfort he could use and discard, a safe harbor he could visit when his own seas were too rough, but never a place he intended to stay. The next few days were a masterclass in avoidance. The fog had rolled into the entire apartment, a thick, suffocating blanket of unspoken tension. We moved around each other like ghosts. The easy camaraderie that had been the bedrock of our friendship was gone, replaced by a stilted, painful politeness. We made our coffee at different times. We ate our meals alone in our rooms. The silence was no longer comfortable or conspiratorial. It was a weapon, a chasm of awkwardness that we both seemed terrified to cross. Liam looked haunted. He had dark circles under his eyes, and he seemed to be working even more, using his project as a shield, a justifiable reason to stay locked in his room. He was withdrawing, not just from me, but from himself. He couldn't reconcile his action, kissing his male best friend, with his own self-perception, with the straight, uncomplicated life he had always believed he was living. He was in a state of profound emotional conflict, and his response was to shut down, to pretend it never happened. But the ghost of that kiss lingered in every room, in every shared space. It was in the air we breathed. For my part, I was cycling through a painful rotation of emotions: hurt, anger, frustration, and a deep, weary sadness. The anger was the most surprising. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for his emotional illiteracy, for making me a participant in his confusion and then abandoning me in the wreckage. I was angry at myself for being so vulnerable, for holding on to a hope that was clearly a fantasy. I felt used. The ritual, which had once felt so intimate and special, now seemed tainted, a monument to my own naivety. After 3 days of this agonizing silence, I knew I couldn't let it stand. The ambiguity was poison. I would rather have a clean, painful break than this slow, torturous death of our friendship. I needed honesty, even if that honesty was a confirmation of my worst fears. I needed him to look me in the eye and tell me what that kiss meant or what it didn't mean. I needed the truth, because the not knowing was infinitely worse. I found him in the kitchen late one evening, staring into an empty mug as if it held the answers to the universe. He looked up when I entered, a flicker of panic in his eyes, but he didn't leave. This was it. "We need to talk," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I leaned against the counter opposite him, creating a no man's land on the tiled floor between us. He nodded, not meeting my gaze. "I know, what was that, Liam?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. "The other night. What was that?" He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. "I told you I was exhausted. I was confused. It was a mistake, don't," I said, and my voice was sharper than I intended. "Don't you dare call it a mistake. It might have been a lot of things, confusing, scary, ill-advised, but it wasn't a mistake. It was the most honest thing that has happened between us in years. And you can't just take it back because it scares you." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, cornered anguish. "What do you want me to say, Ethan? I don't know what it was. I don't know what's going on with me. My whole life is a mess. My job is killing me. And I'm so lonely I feel like I'm coming apart at the seams. And you're just here. You're quiet, and you're steady, and you make me feel better. You make the world stop spinning for a little while. And that night, I wanted more. I wanted to be closer. I don't know why. I don't understand it. It was a confession, raw and unfiltered. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't a user. He was just a man who was profoundly lost, a man whose emotional compass was spinning wildly, pointing in a direction he had never anticipated. He was terrified of what it meant. His withdrawal wasn't a rejection of me, specifically. It was a rejection of a part of himself he didn't know how to face. My anger began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of empathy. I saw him not as the unknowing initiator who had hurt me, but as a man struggling with his own unexpected journey of self-discovery. He was at the beginning of a road I had been walking for a very long time. "Okay," I said, my voice softening. "Okay, you don't have to understand it right now, but you have to stop running from it. And you have to stop running from me. This silence, it's killing us, Liam. It's killing our friendship. I would rather have you yell at me. Tell me you're confused. Tell me you hate what happened. Anything is better than this. Than you pretending I don't exist." Tears welled in his eyes, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and this time, the apology felt real. It wasn't an apology for the kiss. It was an apology for the silence, for the fear, for the hurt he had caused. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I'm just scared." "I know," I said. And I did. I knew that fear intimately. Me too. The confrontation hadn't solved anything. Not really. But it had lanced the wound. It had let the poison out. We had replaced the suffocating silence with a fragile, terrifying honesty. He was confused and scared. I was hurt and scared. We were two scared people, standing in a kitchen, with the ruins of our old friendship at our feet, and no map for what to build in its place. But for the first time in days, we were looking at each other again. We were in the same room, breathing the same air, acknowledging the same, undeniable truth. Something had changed between us, and we would have to figure it out together. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing a landscape that was daunting and uncertain, but at least, at long last, it was one we could both see. The new foundation of our relationship was built not on grand romantic gestures or definitive declarations, but on small, deliberate acts of honesty. The conversation in the kitchen did not magically resolve Liam's confusion or erase my hurt, but it did create a new kind of space between us, a space for grace. We started talking, not about the kiss, not at first, but about everything else. He started telling me more about the stress at work, not just the technical problems, but the way the pressure made him feel small and incompetent. I started telling him about my photography, about the frustration of a creative block, about the quiet joy of capturing a perfect, fleeting moment. We were relearning how to be friends, but this time with a new, underlying awareness, a layer of vulnerability that had never existed before. The ritual of him asking me to stay with him stopped. The nights were quiet again, our bedroom doors closed. And while a part of me missed the intimacy, another, wiser part knew it was necessary. We couldn't rely on that crutch anymore. The ritual had served its purpose. It had forced a truth to the surface. Now, we had to learn to navigate our new reality in the daylight. The healing was slow, like the development of a photograph in a darkroom. An image was emerging, faint and uncertain at first, but gradually gaining clarity and definition. We were rebuilding trust, moment by moment. It was in a shared, easy laugh over a bad movie. It was in him asking for my opinion on a personal email and actually listening to my response. It was in me showing him a set of new photos and seeing a genuine, unforced appreciation in his eyes. About 2 weeks after our confrontation, we were sitting on the couch, a comfortable distance between us, reading in a shared, peaceful silence. It was late, and the apartment was filled with that familiar, sleepy quiet. I felt him looking at me, and I glanced up from my book. He had an expression on his face I hadn't seen before. Not confusion, not anxiety, but a kind of calm, quiet contemplation. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said softly. I waited, my heart giving a hopeful, cautious flutter. "About me. About us," he continued, his gaze steady. I think I've been lonely for a very long time, and I just didn't know what to call it. And I think I've been hiding from a lot of things. When I'm with you, I don't have to hide. I was so scared of what that kiss meant, because it didn't fit into the story I had always told myself about my life. But the story was wrong. Or maybe just incomplete. He took a breath. What I felt that night, it wasn't a mistake. It was real, and it's still real. I think I have feelings for you, Ethan. He said it so simply, so calmly. There was no drama, no fanfare. Just a quiet statement of a new truth he had finally allowed himself to accept. He wasn't asking me for anything. He was just telling me. He was offering me the honesty I had asked for, an honesty he had finally found within himself. A slow, warm wave of relief washed over me, so powerful it almost made me dizzy. The years of waiting, of hiding, of aching, it all just released. I didn't need to confess my own feelings. He could see it in my face. He had always been there, just beneath the surface of my quiet friendship. "I know," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I have feelings for you, too." For a long time, a slow smile spread across his face, a real smile, one that reached his eyes and lit them from within. It was like seeing the sun after a long, gray winter. He didn't move closer, didn't rush the moment. We just sat there, on opposite ends of the couch, and looked at each other, really looked at each other, for the first time, as who we now were. The silence that fell was not empty or awkward. It was full. It was peaceful. It was the sound of two people finally arriving in the same place at the same time. From that day on, everything was different. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. We started over, but this time, together. We went on a date. We walked through a park, and he reached for my hand, lacing his fingers through mine, not in the hesitant darkness of his bedroom, but in the bright, clear light of a Sunday afternoon. It felt natural. It felt right. We learned to be romantic with the same comfortable rhythm that had defined our friendship. The change was both monumental and seamless. He was still Liam, the man I had known for years, but now I was allowed to love him out loud. I was still Ethan, the quiet observer, but now I was a part of the picture, no longer just the man behind the camera. The domestic intimacy returned, but it was different. It was intentional. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, he appeared in my doorway. His own door was wide open behind him, his room illuminated and welcoming. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, a soft, questioning look in his eyes. And I understood. I turned off my light, walked across the hall, and followed him into his room. The door, which for so long had been a symbol of our separation, a boundary to be cautiously tested, was now closed behind us, shutting out the rest of the world. There was no pretext. There was no anxiety. There was no ritual. There was just us. We got into his bed, and he pulled me close, his arm wrapping around me, my head finding its natural place on his chest. I could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath my ear. He was safe. He was home. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. We found that the truest connections are not built in grand, sweeping moments, but in the quiet spaces in between. They are forged in shared coffee and comfortable silences, in the courage to admit you are lonely, and in the profound grace of the person who simply agrees to sit with you in the dark. We had been two separate people, living in our own quiet rooms of fear and loneliness, but by finally having the courage to open our doors, we discovered that we were not just building a new relationship. We were, at long last, building a home.